Hi Susie, thank you for agreeing to have this conversation
Pleasure.
About Shame Chorus. I just really wanted to ask you a few questions really about the project, and also to explore shame in maybe a wider context as well. So we've been involved in the project for like 2 years, and you brilliantly agreed to do a series of psychoanalytic interviews with members of the London Gay Men's Chorus. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about your experiences of that, why you think it was an important thing to be involved in, and yeah, just a sort of more of a general insight into your thoughts about the project.
Well, I think it was a no-brainer, really, because it's so interesting to be invited to add something to an activity that already exists. So that was a pleasure. But I suppose the most interesting thing for me was not the psychoanalytic conversations, but it's what you did with them, what the composers did with the words, and the music, the art that you made from it, all of you. And the encounters I had with the men who were so moved by their experience was obviously because they could see their words contributing to something bigger than themselves, and so they were making something for not just gay men, but for the world, really. This is about a piece of experience at this moment in history, and there's something that we need to. It was just a ravishing project, I think that.
Yeah. Did you find any kind of commonalities in the interviews? Any sort of connections between the men, or were all their stories very different?
The stories are very different at the same time as being the same. It's one of those things about who we are. We have a common humanity. We hurt in the same way, even if we don't have the same words to describe it. We feel exclusion in very similar ways, and isolation. And what was most interesting was the importance of finding community. From entering into the chorus, the choir, a fellowship, where people were absolutely so different from each other and yet could bond and support each other. So I think that's what I felt about it.
Yeah, I think that was particularly evident for me as well, because the more that I worked with them, the more I could see that trust to develop, and they almost became this little band of
they were
us against the world.
I could see that they were. I think quite a lot of them had studied science, maths or science or engineering. So I don't know whether that was a place of safety while all the other difficulties of growing up were going on. That was the only other common thing, and I may be wrong. I may have just heard that.
You did mention in a conversation that we had about what you felt the importance of community. You may have felt that you've already answered this, but do you want to say a little bit more about how important you feel community is generally in terms of maybe...
Well, I just don't know. I just don't think we know who we are as isolates, and everything about our culture these days is that we're supposed to sell ourselves, brand ourselves, and decorate and change ourselves, and actually it's so alienating and so difficult, and is really part of a neoliberal agenda. It's not really about how you connect and how you engage and how you contribute. And community is the way that you do that. Community allows you to know yourself and to know others, and to know yourselves as a community.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's what I found. One of the things, as I said, was fascinating for me was to see of how you build a community as well. But
doesn't that show you how much need there is?
Yeah,
too?
yeah.
I mean, even if things fracture,
which they did,
there is nevertheless the desire to make connection, to bond, to be understood, to listen, to hear.
And I think also some of the men, it was their stories that they were talking about, and some it was part from the wider chorus, but also there was that too, that there's a very, very strong feeling of being willing to put yourself on the line because they realised how important that was. And actually how individually liberating it was for them as well. One of the singers in particular had been interviewed by you, and he said something kind of switched in the way that he thought about an issue that he'd been struggling with for a long time, and speaking with you and also that whole process helped him to kind of overcome that that level of difficulty that he'd experienced for years, actually.
Well, I think conversation is really powerful.
Yeah.
It's very, very different than communicating online.
Yeah.
And singing together is also very important, isn't it? So
I think that was the key thing, really. I think it was the actual act of community coming through singing as well, which seems
is
to be more
another
powerful
form
than
of
sharing
voice.
voices. Yeah, exactly. When I was researching for this project, there was quite a lot of discussion about the difference between guilt and shame and what the differences are, or if there are any differences. And I was just wondering if you might clarify what you feel the difference is, maybe in terms of a mechanism, how guilt operates in it maybe in a different way from shame, or maybe it doesn't, I don't know.
I don't think they're the same.
Right.
We've all got the capacity for a whole kaleidoscope of emotions, and part of my job is for people to be able to identify actually what they are feeling. And just like you have many, many notes in music, and many shades and many chords and many ways to play, from staccato to largo, it's the same with emotions. And I think shame has a lot more to do with longings and desires that are impermissible, aren't received, that then produce a feeling of unentitlement to have them. And that's very, very painful. And it's about not being seen and not being recognised externally, therefore you can't feel okay about what emerges from you. I think guilt it's a different category. I don't think they are the same. It might be you have guilt for having caused harm, or guilt for something you haven't done but you feel responsible for, or guilt because you think you're inadequate at something. So I think it's in different registers. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Does shame need an audience as well? Do you need to be shamed by someone?
I don't think... Well, look, there's no such thing as the individual without a set of internal relationships in your head, because we're human.
Yeah.
And that is what it means to be human. So you could say there's inner relationships, but there's also the parts of you that embody something about how you've been received, or greeted or not greeted, that then becomes represented as somebody else or some other part of you. And so in that sense, yes, shame is an internal relationship with that.
Right, okay, yeah. I was just wondering if this might lead on to maybe a wider discussion of some of the other, if you have been involved in other projects which you feel have challenged or tackle issues around sort of shame and empowerment.
Well, I suppose my original interest in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy came out of being a member of the women's liberation movement, and it's a very long time ago, but trying to understand why we worked in the way we did. Why did we cooperate in things that weren't in our own interest? What were the unconscious processes? We couldn't explain that sufficiently through economics or through other mechanisms of understanding. So that's why I got interested in psychotherapy, not the conventional psychotherapy. We kind of had to remake it in our own image way back in the 70s, but we weren't the only people. There were a lot of people doing that. And of course we had to contest, all sorts of ideas about, why heterosexuality? We understood it for men actually much more easily than we understood it for women. And what about issues of class and how all of that gets internalised, and issues of ethnicity and race and issues of... But the projects, I don't think any of us... And I'm very involved with a group called Endangered Bodies, which is about trying to take on the merchants of body hatred, so that girls and women, and increasingly boys, don't practice assault on themselves and dare to live from their own bodies. But nothing is quite as... and so there have been several plays that came out of that, and there were several plays that came out of that as a feminist issue. Tons of them, actually, from Spare Tire Theatre Company.
Yeah.
So I suppose if I think about it, I have had a whole cultural story, but I don't usually think about it until you ask the question.
Right. And talking about those kind of levels of intersectionality, so you talked about race and class, and maybe thinking about the men that you interviewed as well. Did you feel that was particularly coming into play? Because
a lot of class was coming into play.
Right.
And non-metropolitanism.
Yes, there was. I saw some of the interviews, and I think there was it was quite typified in that that song "Small Town Boy."
Yeah.
There was quite a lot of that move to the city and finding community very much within an urban, more cosmopolitan environment. And that was something that really struck me. There was a lot of discussion about I came from a small village, or I came from a Yeah, it was. I thought that was really interesting.
Me
actually,
too.
the way that all those things kind of sat with one another in certain ways. Do you think, because in the project, shame was always seen as something that obviously was very negative, very harmful, something maybe to understand, liberate oneself from, but. And I'm thinking of things like this, for example, Me Too and various things that have been happening with Harvey Weinstein and people like that. And I'm just wondering if you think that if shame can ever be used in a kind of productive or a political way in some way. This idea of calling people out, and or whether you feel that generally contributes to a kind of quite harmful culture.
I think we're in the middle of it all now, so it's hard to. It's just part of the process, isn't it? I think it's important for women who've carried the shame to dump the shame out, and for it to land up on the place that it should land up, which is not on them. But we do live in a culture that wants to dump shame in all sorts of places, and you have to ask yourself, what's that about? Why do we have such a notion of? I mean, it's in that sense, shame is toxic. It's not it's not. There's nothing progressive about exploring it in those contexts. But I don't know if I can really answer the question well enough for you.
Because we're in the middle of it.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you saw any groups or artists or theorists that were kind of reclaiming shame in a way, like a lot of the ways that identities of, negative descriptions have been like reclaimed and language has been reclaimed, or maybe again we're in the middle of that. So
I haven't. That doesn't mean that isn't happening, but I think it's a really important question that you're raising. I know that when you asked me to do a series of interviews, conversations around shame, I was reluctant.
Yeah, I remember you asked me really clearly, why me? Why?
I wasn't surprised it was me. I was surprised at the shame thing, really, because I was thinking, is it going to be more painful to people to talk about that?
Yeah.
Because it's not an ongoing conversation. So, but I think it's an important corrective to part of. Look, there isn't just pride. There's all the other aspects of what it means to be a gay man. And that is what you would be, part of what you would be dealing with in therapy. So I think it was a very brave and a very important project.
Well, also about how people's lives have been very much shaped by shame as well.
Absolutely.
It's the core of quite a lot of people's identity is this, for better or for worse, but it's, I think in some ways it's literally made them the people that they are. I'm also really interested in how toxic it is. As soon as you start to talk about shame, you'll kind of find you're the only white person left in the room. And that very much happened within the London Gay Men's Chorus as well. Some people accused me of being very irresponsible. That there was a feeling that I was letting the side down.
But I think that's very similar to sort of the work that I've done, or particularly with Louise Eichenbaum, where we were talking about difficulties in women's relationships, and people saw that as, how dare you expose envy, competition, anger, issues of merger. But yes, if we don't get to the underbelly of the difficulties that have been created and constitute what it means to be feminine or gay or whatever at this moment, and if we don't get to that, then actually it's a disservice, because we're just glossing over things.
That's what I found. But again, there was quite a lot of. I almost feel that there was anger that it should almost been. It was sort of bad propaganda or something.
Yeah, no, I'm
it should
sure
be
that
about pride all the time.
Yeah, but I just don't think that's too synthetic, isn't it?
Well, and also I think it was interesting for me because the London Gay Men's Chorus, if you could use that word, were quite homonormative. There was nothing very queer about the way that they are and what they talk about. So I think that was quite interesting as well, that it sort of challenged their own ideas about what gay politics
Well,
were.
I think it is so hard, because if I use my own experience with talking about women, it's like, don't rock the boat now, because women are trying to have more power. So why are you raising the way in which, in pre-feminist terms, women would be talking about bitches and envy and coffee clutches and all of that, which was such a derogation and an insult about women's relationships. So to actually say, well, wait a minute, there are some of these things that exist which we need to deal with, which have to do with how the patriarchy constitutes itself inside of us, that's really important to get to grips with.
I agree. It was a very difficult project for me to undertake, and I had to spend a lot of time convincing people that, to do work about shame was relevant, not damaging, would eventually be something which was very positive, and didn't actually manage to convince everybody. And unfortunately, some who weren't convinced anonymously wrote to me, and I thought, well, that's such a shame, because actually you're the people that I would love to be having the conversations with, but you won't declare yourself in terms of being allowing me to have those conversations with
Shame.
you. Yeah, literally it was, yeah. So I think we touched on this, but I'm quite interested in this idea of individualism, and the sort of rampant individualism that's going on at the moment. And I just read an article actually today. I can't remember her name, but she was talking about neoliberal feminism and the way that there's been a whole lot of books which kind of want to monetize or kind of almost make an economic transaction. So and again, the idea of some women within feminist discourse talking about kind of being able to manage their lives better, and it being very much a kind of individualist, not thinking about community, not thinking about...
Well, because everything in our society is against thinking about anything in any kind of collective form, isn't it? I mean, once you've left school, there isn't a collective form. I mean, in offices you're encouraged to compete against each other. It's not there's not cooperative practices except in exceptional cases. And of course you're going to have neoliberal feminists. Of course you're going to have that. We just don't come from that stripe. But
when you do talk, do you feel that there is a kind of a neoliberal... Is it changing the language in some way? Do you think people are beginning to... Because it's quite naturalised, neoliberalism, in a sense. We're living in the middle of it. Do you feel... Have you noticed that people are thinking about themselves in more of a maybe more transactional way, or maybe in terms of like their worth being about what they cost almost?
Definitely, and particularly for younger people.
Yeah.
And also the idea that you have a career and that you plan it, and you have this, you're going to do this hit then and this then, and it's that's very different. So yes, I think I suppose people who are highly educated think in those terms. They might be strategic, which I don't suppose was true for my generation at all.
So I suppose it's a bit of a weights and balances, isn't it? You've talked a lot about gains being made, but also maybe in the current
Well, I don't think
climate
the gains were made in a straightforward way. I think we got a lot of pushback. I don't think there was the most terrible pushback in the period of Thatcher in Britain and Reagan in America, and the religious right, and I mean, so I don't think it's. I think we would have done fine if we hadn't had all of that pushback, frankly. Because we would have been able to think. I mean, all the agendas that we were thinking about in the olden days, which is what I think of, they were all the same agendas. That's what's so appalling, is how do we raise children? What constitutes a work-life balance? You know, how do you? Although we were more into contribution, so we weren't really into me. Even though we had consciousness-raising groups, it wasn't so individualistic. It was more, what would it mean to have women's health, or to have actually that be your perspective? I mean, so a lot of the agendas are the same, except, as you say, there's a whole swathe of things that are monetized. And of course, when this would have been true for gay male couples, but certainly for women, in my day, you couldn't get a mortgage, or even some women couldn't get credit cards without their husbands signing. And so that is really, I mean, that's only 40 years ago.
Yeah, no, it's quite remarkable, isn't it, to think that, yes, it's not very long at all. It's not very long at all. I suppose also this could be the final question. Just kind of what strategies do you think individuals can adopt to combat feelings of shame? I mean, especially we've talked about sort of class and maybe not having, whether income maybe it could affect that access as well and things like that. And so, what you feel might be the key things in terms of individuals
I think
helping them?
But I think shame, because it's so privatised and it's such a private feeling, which is what you try to contest. I don't think there's anything that beats anything like talking to somebody, a friend, or maybe showing them a film of the work you've done and provoking things. And everything that we feel ashamed about is always better when we've talked about it.
I think that was the thing, wasn't it? For the whole project, people that were suspicious could see how the value of sharing was once they'd kind of almost taken the deep breath and go, okay, I'm going to tell you about this now. It seemed to be the act of telling it wasn't even necessarily a conclusion, but it was just about the actual act of telling and sharing, which seemed to be the most powerful part of that.
And now I think we've got enough consciousness that we do know that shame as a sort of cultural, political story for being gay is tragic. We know that that's not okay, and we really do not think that is a good way to raise children. And some of the Section 28. Let's not forget, that's not very long ago. That was in the late 70s.
Yeah.
So again, it's very, very important that kids are being brought up, and because gayness exists, or queerness exists, or trans issues exist across the board now, ordinary people are having to talk about them, and that's good, because even if people have difficulty, at least it's part of a public conversation.
Thank you. I think that's a really good place to leave it, actually.
Okay.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Okay.
Thank you.